Hello everyone, it's so good to be here again. I just came back from the cinema after seeing Monkey Man, a film that I've been very much looking forward to and actually got a chance to catch up with one of my friends. But lo and behold, just as we sat down in our seats, a moment later we were evacuated from the Atwater Forum building. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but it seems that someone sprayed pepper spray into the ventilation system, thus evacuating the whole building. And no kidding, I did have the impression as I was waiting for my friend that my throat was slightly burning progressively as I was waiting for him. So yeah, the whole building was cordoned off and we ended up going to another cinema, a bit more of a ghetto cinema in Cotonou. And actually, ambience-wise, it kind of worked in the film's favor because indeed there's a big Filipino community as well as an Indian community, as well as there was quite a rowdy crowd that night who were exclaiming and reacting out loud throughout the whole film, so it did add quite a bit of spice to the film's experience. But in any case, outside events put aside for a brief moment, this is a film that I was very much looking forward to, not only because I'm a huge fan of martial arts flicks, I watched so many of them, I'm not even going to get into the whole list of that here, but I also do happen to be quite a big Dev Patel fan. He really does have this wonderful charismatic star power presence, and of course he does play the lead role in this film, but not only that, this also marks his directorial debut, so I'm super interested in being there day one to see how his film fares. And not only that, but it seems like he went through hell literally to see this film come to fruition in the end. There was a COVID pandemic which threw a massive curveball into film's production for obvious reasons. It seems there was a lot of political red tape he had to go through as well to get the film rolling, which it seems that the film was catching dust on the shelves for quite a long time. It literally did get thrown on the rug by Netflix, and it seems like a lot of the Indian film community was rather put off by the gritty and extreme nature of this film for frankly understandable reasons. So literally it does seem like it was a bit of a cursed production, but luckily it seems that Jordan Peele took an interest in the film and helped to see this film see the light of day, because he did feel that this is a film that deserves to have its moment in the spotlight. And for the most part, I do agree. There's a lot to love about this film, but I don't think it's perfect. Actually, quite far from it. There's quite a lot of holes I could poke into it. But to start off on a more positive note and list out some of the things that really excels at, of course, the gritty and chaotic nature of the action is quite potent, and it does stick out quite strongly from almost everything you would see coming out of a Hollywood film production. There's a truly exhilarating chase sequence in the film, and there's so many fantastic locations. Really, from an art direction point of view, I think the locations, the props, all the set design, all that is fantastic. The costume design, the makeup, the whole gritty and bloody aspect of it is so well realized, as well as a lot of the cinematography and color palettes I find quite potent. So in that regard, for the most part, it just knocks it out the park, though it does have some weaker aspects in that regard, which I will get to soon enough. But for an action film, this is a film that actually tackles quite a lot of interesting ideas. Not all of them perfectly, but that sense of childhood trauma is quite powerfully instilled in this film. And I am fascinated by a lot of the spiritual, religious, and cultural aspects that are infused into this film. I do feel that it does bite off a bit more than it could chew, but what is there is quite fascinating. The whole mythos of Hanuman is an element of the film that I found quite intriguing. And of course, Dev Patel gives a brilliant performance. His star power is shining very, very bright here, but this is also a side of Dev Patel that we've rarely, if ever, gotten to see quite to this extent. He is absolutely shredded in this film, and it really is a super physical performance that he gives here. He has great action timing and presence, and I think the part that I love most of his performance is that it actually has this level of grounding that I find quite refreshing. This isn't what we see in so many action or Hollywood films, that your main star is basically this superhuman entity. Actually, no, he's quite flawed. He fails quite often throughout most of the film, which is why it's so exhilarating to see him get up every single time, no matter how hard he gets beaten down. And speaking of Dev Patel getting back up no matter how hard he was being down, my god, this guy has the endurance and willpower of a titan. Reading up on the behind the scenes stories of the making of this film, there's so much wild shit that I've been learning. So apparently he had his foot broken before even starting the official shooting of the film in rehearsals. Ouch. And then also, if I'm not mistaken, he broke his fist within the first real fight that they were filming for the film, and actually didn't put on a cast for the rest of the shooting sequences because they just did not have the budget to VFX out the cast from the film. And I don't know if you saw the trailer, but it's not like he goes soft for the rest of of the film. He goes so hard no matter what kind of injuries he may have sustained. He also had a serious eye infection at one point in time because there's this bathroom sequence in particular where he's literally just rubbing his face into the grimy floor. It's dirty, unsanitary. There's stale water, toilet bowl water just pouring all over the place. It's grimy and disgusting, and no matter what kind of trials and tribulations he was put through, he still powered through. So this truly is an underdog story in the best way. So those all are very potent positive aspects of the film. But like I said, there's quite a lot of other elements that I find much more hit or miss in my humble opinion. That doesn't mean that I don't enjoy the film anymore. For example, as much as I do love the action, I think some of the camera work is way too shaky to the point where it's almost impossible to understand what the hell is going on. In some instances, the chaotic aspect works great, and specifically in the chase sequence where Dev is clearly wounded and just hazy after all he's gone through, the disorienting aspect can work in its favor, but all too frequently I felt I was completely lost in the chaos. Now that doesn't mean that I want every action film to be this long shot cuts in a stable environment like you see in so many action films nowadays, which is wonderful, don't get me wrong. I do like this more raw aspect to it, but I do find that also on the editing side, there's so many great sequences that get kneecapped way too early. There's a sequence later in the film where Dev Patel jumps up on this counter and the whole bar has this beautiful backlighting that almost gives this like 2D like Street Fighter Mortal Kombat vibe. I thought was one of my favorite cinematic shots of the film, but it's so brief. And that's just one example. There are countless of them in this film, unfortunately. I do think it's worth mentioning that though there may be these kind of technical issues in the film, unfortunate as it may be, it's kind of understandable because Dev Patel went through hell to make this film come to light. There's so many behind the scenes stories that I just find fascinating, and I really do invite you all to go check it out for yourselves. One story in particular that I thought was particularly unique and that may be a key to addressing some of the criticisms that I'm bringing up over here. For example, he walks into the set and he's shocked because a lot of the set pieces, the destructible tables that he planned, just aren't there. He looks at the set designer like, dude, like, where's everything? The guy looked at him like, there's no money, bro. Like, we don't have it. So they were literally forced to shoot all the action sequences like from like shoulder up to just not show the things that should be there that aren't there. So these super quick editing, this might be another case of like, well, they just had to do it. They were adapting to the realities in real time in some pretty creative ways, so I'll take off my hat to them in that regard at the very least. Truly, this is an example of art through adversity, but even so, I do believe in the spirit of constructive criticism. It's worth bringing up. And perhaps I am in the minority in this regard, but I do wish that the English language was not the predominant language. I would have loved almost a full Indian dialogue throughout the entire film. It's not something that breaks the experience for me, of course, but in this era where international films are getting more and more stage presence, I do feel that it is something that could have benefited the film's immersion. And without going too much into spoiler territory, as far as the childhood trauma elements go, the flashbacks were effective and powerful, no arguments there, but I do feel that they're repeated far too often. And actually, one point later in the film, it's actually completely revealed and explained without any gray zone whatsoever, and frankly, I don't think that was necessary at all. Even without that sequence or some of the repeated sections, I think we had all the info we ever would have needed throughout the rest of the film. So it is a moment that I feel that over-explained itself and also kind of hurt the pacing of the film. The film does fluctuate in its pacing and has some tonal shift issues a little too often to my liking, and this is one of the bigger areas in that regard as far as I'm concerned. And actually around that full reveal of this childhood trauma, everything else that was happening in the story around that full explanation that was totally unnecessary was so much more interesting, and I do feel like it totally robbed its power from those elements. So it was like a double sin at the same time, which really is a shame because I do feel that there's so many interesting ideas that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, I do feel that the film bites off a little bit more than it can chew. It is interesting that an action film goes into all these different areas, but it's a classic situation of a jack of all trades but a master of none. These spiritual, cultural aspects are quite fascinating, but they are rather paper thin. There is even a trance thing going on at one point in the film that actually I thought was really interesting. This whole idea of this duality between man, woman, and the different aspects of God, the God the destroyer, God the creator. So there was actually something really interesting to explore there that I feel that it kind of opened the door to, but never actually fully explored. The same could be said for the whole political aspect of the film, which once again, it's kind of just thrown out there like, yes, this is happening, but it's paper thin. And finally, on this note, there's this romantic narrative arc going on here, which is totally hollow. It was kind of cute, yeah, but if we would have totally axed it from the film, it would have changed nothing at all in the film whatsoever, and actually might have helped the overall tone and pacing of the film. I do think that there is quite a bit of data that could have been left on the cutting room floor. And speaking of tonal shifts, there are quite a few needle drops in this film, and they're all over the place. Not saying they're all bad. There's one early in the film that's this rap banger that totally worked well. Now, post having seen the film, I did identify that this is a JID song, 151 Rum, and my god is it a banger. It was a banger in the film, and it was a banger now that I'm listening to it. And not gonna lie, the rowdy bunch of kids that I mentioned earlier on in the video, they were vibing so hard to the track. Literally just... literally that in the cinema. Those guys were a riot, and once again, it did add quite an interesting flavor to the film experience. But then we have these sequences of these 70s and 80s hits, and then further on we have these classic songs remixed with this like dance electronic vibe. And later in the film, for all the more climactic action sequences, we have this like total metal mosh pit rager going on. So yeah, it's quite a wide arc over here, and I don't find all that much consistency. Though I will say musically, there is one sequence in the film that I absolutely loved. So there's this workout session that's like paired with this jam session at the same time. I thought it was super invigorating and kind of creative and super cool. And I do feel that it taps into more spiritual and cultural thematics that the film tried to explore. So I do think thematically it was so much more important than any of the other needle drops that the film presented. So yeah, the film is rather rough around the edges. This is not a rock solid film like On Back, a film that it's clearly inspired from. Not hating on Dev Patel, as I mentioned earlier, I do think he gives a great performance, but indeed when you compare him to someone like Tony Jaa, there's a massive gulf in the martial arts mastery that's on screen. And there's also obvious inspirations from Bruce Lee, specifically Enter the Dragon. There is a boss fight, if you will, later in the film that totally takes a feather out of the cap from that Hall of Mirrors in the climactic scene of that film. And before I forget, that final boss fight in Monkey Man was kind of a letdown, in my humble opinion, of course. So with all the critical feedback that I could give the film, I do see myself giving this a 6 out of 10, but I am kind of leaning more towards a 7 out of 10 because the parts that I do like about it are absolutely fantastic. There's this whorehouse sequence in particular that may be my favorite sequence of the film, and once again, the chase sequence was exhilarating. The highlights are super high, and what can I say? I do love an underdog story. It really does seem like Dev Patel went through hell to make this film, and it does feel like it. That chaotic nature really does reflect itself quite potently in the film. So whatever faults this film may have, it more than makes up for in spirit and raw power. And I do want to underline that raw power because no, this isn't the mastery of martial arts you'll see from like Bruce Lee or Tony Jaa, as I mentioned, but there is this really rugged and raw, gritty underdog vibe to it that I totally vibe with. And before I forget, this film has a $10 million budget, which considering all the bloody bone-breaking action sequences, the level of complexity that entails, including all the locations and the cast and all that, it is somewhat of a miracle that the film looks as good as it does with that taken into consideration. So even if it is rough around the edges, I totally recommend you guys to go check it out and keep an open mind because it is quite a lot of fun. And there's some pretty wild things that Dev Patel does in this film. I never thought I'd see Dev Patel biting so often in a film. Holy crap, was this a physical performance. So yeah, go check it out. With all that being said, as always, wishing you and your loved ones nothing but the best. Take care and talk to you soon.